In this lecture, what I want to cover is the response of Europe to the revolution. And in this case, I'm going to go a little beyond in terms of chronology, the first lecture. It may be helpful to watch this lecture even after you've watched the French Empire, so you can line them up. But I think it's helpful to trace you through all of the responses of Europeans to, or the rest of Europe, to the French Revolution, than trying to parcel it out otherwise. And to make sense of the varied responses, I've come up with sort of three ways of seeing how Europeans responded. First with resistance, then with a sense of reassessment, and then perhaps with revolution. So to begin with, start with resistance. The first and foremost way in which Europe responded to the French Revolution was through military resistance. Monarchs across Europe saw the French Revolution as an existential threat to their rule, especially after Louis XVI is executed by Robespierre and his allies. That's certainly not a type of government you want to promote. Some in America, some in England had seen the revolution as a positive development, but by the time of the September massacres, any good feelings as the French Revolution turned more violent, they turned away from that. And so in terms of resistance, most of the European powers assemble and try and go to war against the French Revolution, against the revolutionary armies to protect their interests and perhaps destroy the revolution itself. And indeed, there's going to be a war of coalitions, 8 coalitions, wars of the coalition. So sequence of coalitions of assembled powers of Europe against France. The one constant in all of this is Great Britain. It stands as the constant enemy of revolutionary France. They see it as an existential threat, not so much in terms of politics, but if France comes to dominate the continent of Europe, it threatens all of the empire, all of the peace and stability of the British Isles and its empire. So they're the constant enemy. So one of the main ways in which they resist is through active military resistance. But it doesn't necessarily need to come from the states. Even the quote-unquote people could rise up. In 1808, the French armies invaded Spain, and Napoleon put his brother on the throne of Spain, Joseph I. And in response, the people of Spain, who saw this as a usurpation of their government, as well as seeing the French as enemies of religion, again, a heavily Catholic nation, rose up against the French state. Despite massive commitments of troops and massive commitment of time and money, the problem was the French never fully pacified the Spanish. Indeed, some have suggested this is a first example of a more modern version of a guerrilla warfare campaign. The French were stationed in cities but controlled little else. And indeed, it was made worse because of Great Britain. Great Britain would fund the Spanish, send them arms, and indeed send troops to try and help. And so thus the Spanish conquest, while successful initially, becomes famously Napoleon's Spanish ulcer, this festering wound that he's never able to completely pacify and sucks down troops and money. To turn to an example of reassessment, I'm going to turn to Prussia. Now, Prussia, if you remember, is this grand, strong, and powerful state based around the power of its military, its army. But Prussia had gone out with great fanfare to defeat the armies of Napoleon, and very quickly at the battles of Jena and Auerstadt were soundly and completely destroyed. And so Prussia has to reassess in a situation whereby their greatest strength, their greatest symbol of their monarchical state, has been destroyed on the field of battle. And so they start a period of reassessment. A group of young military reformers in Prussia start to champion changes that would open up more merit-based qualifications for leadership, opening up officer positions to people who weren't just nobles, but instead looking for the best people, reforms of the state to make it more efficient, reforms of the army to make it a more potent military weapon. And the king goes along with this, even though at one point he worries that a lot of these societal and military changes are quote-unquote Jacobinish, so he thinks they're like the Jacobins. But the best example of a reassessment is what occurs when the Prussian king in 1813 issues a proclamation, "To my people," on mein Volk. It called on the people of Prussia, similar to almost, you will, a Prussian levée en masse, to all rise up against Napoleon, to come together to throw off Napoleonic rule and oppression and rise up and help the Prussian state liberate their land. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal about it? Well, this is the first instance of a Prussian monarch justifying an action by the government to the people. Kings don't have to do that. The fact that the Prussian king feels that this is necessary is a sign of how many changes have occurred in Prussian society as they recognize they have to grapple with the concepts of the French Revolution and rallying the people to the government. The last point to touch on was, well, as much as there was resistance, as much as there were reassessments, it is helpful to realize that there were some parts of Europe that welcomed revolutionary armies as liberators. The French armies, if you will, carried the revolution and its ideals in their rucksacks. They would find sans-culottes in other major European cities. They would find other intellectuals who were attracted to Enlightenment beliefs, who wanted to have an enlightened government. And so this means that as the French conquer, they also find allies across Europe, those who are committed to the revolution and want to bring it to their lands. And indeed, there was a transformative effect across Europe. A good example is during Napoleon's conquest, he ends the Holy Roman Empire. Now, if you believe Voltaire's quip that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, who very much cares? But it's a good example of the transformative changes because the Holy Roman Empire had been in existence since 962. And so you're talking about a constant in European history for centuries. And now it's gone. Now it's no more. This is a huge sign of the changes that the French Revolutionary conquest could bring. But a good example of people deeply committed to the revolution and seeing it as liberation are, well, the Poles. If you remember, they were divided up by those enlightened despots. Well, what do they get when Napoleon comes? Well, when Napoleon comes, he creates a Duchy of Warsaw. He liberates the Poles and gives them a state. And they see him as a liberator. They see him as a bringer of freedom to their people, a restorer of their state. It's not surprising that when Napoleon goes off and invades Russia, the Poles contribute thousands, tens of thousands of men to the cause in order to try and support the person that they feel is their liberator and protector. And so what you should see in all these instances is the French Revolution, though occurring in France, is having transformative, if you will, aftershocks across the rest of the continent. This is a sign that the French Revolution is not going away and is having transformative changes across the continent, far in excess of maybe what any ruler was capable of conceiving.